let's just start with tell me about your service. You're a Marine Corps veteran, and when did you first serve?
Yeah, so I joined the Marine Corps in 2006, right out of high school. And at that time, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were still going on in full swing. Iraq was more in the news than Afghanistan was for sure. But, it was in high school and the memories of 9/11 were still very fresh. And I had a very patriotic sense of duty instilled in me. So it really meant a lot to serve my country. And I decided to join the Marine Corps. And I left for Paris Island, South Carolina Marine Corps boot camp on June 19th, 2006 with my close friend Nick Exaros. And we ended up going to boot camp together, got separated a bit, which is kind of a story in itself once we were in boot camp. So we graduated different times, but we met up again in the Fleet Marine Corps in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. We were both infantry, and I was with the 2nd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion. He was with 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. And we deployed to Iraq with our separate battalions in 2008 to the Al Anbar province. And by that time, Iraq was still a very dangerous place, but it really depended where you were and what you were doing. And
Mhm.
where the Marine Corps was, there'd been a lot of battles fought in those previous years that we had been there, 5 years of war, and they had stabilized it a lot and gotten it to a point where in many places, and I can only speak on where I was, but the Marine Corps was being used almost more as a police force and an occupation force than a warfighting force. And again, that was my experience. So it seemed to me that while Iraq was still very dangerous, a shift had happened in a positive direction in the area that I was in, at least. Um, Nick was in the city of Ramadi, which was, I would say, significantly more dangerous than where I was. And he had his own experiences there with various things that I wasn't there for, but heard about afterwards. And then we came back from Iraq in 2008, and in 2009, President Obama decided to put together what's called the Marine Expeditionary Brigade, and it's approximately 10,000 Marine sailors and Afghan soldiers, and they were in army, and were planning to go into the Helmand province and seize back all these territories along the Helmand River that the British had held for years, but were undermanned and under-equipped and really didn't have the means to hold them. And it had become a Taliban stronghold. It was the center of their opium trade.
Mhm.
So they decided to put together this Marine Expeditionary Brigade, and my battalion, 2nd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, was selected to be part of that. So I had come back from Iraq. Usually what they do is you'll do 7 months in country, then ideally 14 months back in the United States to recoup and then start training again for, to go to war. Because back in that time, with Iraq and Afghanistan being what they were, if you were in an infantry battalion, you were just in a constant rotation of deployments. That's all it was. You'd come back, recover from that deployment, get ready to train for the next one, and so on and so forth, with really no end in sight. But that being said, Afghanistan was really not the main focus of the Marine Corps for a long time. And in 2009, when the Obama administration decided to refocus this effort in Afghanistan to stabilize that after the success they'd had in Iraq, they put together that Marine Expeditionary Brigade, which resulted in me being a part of it. And around the spring of 2009 was when I first deployed to Afghanistan. And we arrived there, and they were assembling at this place called Camp Leatherneck, which was a huge hub for the Helmand province, basically a staging point for this whole giant Marine force to go and do their thing. And my friend Nick, who I mentioned earlier, he also ended up deploying, but with a different battalion. He transferred to 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, because basically he didn't want to miss out on the deployment. He knew it was going to be part of history. So he really, in a pretty remarkable series of events, made some connections to make a transfer to a different battalion, which is really unheard of. So it was a remarkable thing to walk into that in a leadership role that young for a battalion that's about to deploy.
Mhm.
But anyway, so we get to Afghanistan, and we stage at Camp Leatherneck, get ready to go. I see Nick a few times, some of my other friends a few times. And then in late June, I want to say around June 27th, 28th, we left Camp Leatherneck to go push down south to our various areas of operation along the Helmand River Valley. I went to a city, it was called Khan, and no occupying force had been there since the Russians in the 1980s. So
Mhm.
it was a completely, I guess, Wild West, if you want to call it that. So we went down there, set up combat outpost, and being in completely uncharted territory in a lot of these places. the war that I felt I missed in Iraq in a lot of ways, as crazy as that sounds, in hindsight, but we certainly got that in Afghanistan and then plus a lot more. It was very kinetic. The Taliban did not want us there. They were willing to fight us in conventional means at first. And then once they realized they couldn't do that, they resorted to burying improvised explosive devices. And that turned into a whole different war in itself. But it was very different than Iraq. But at the same time, it was still part of that global war on terror. They were still, those conflicts were intertwined in so many ways, in the sense of you had veterans of Iraq in Afghanistan and veterans of Afghanistan in Iraq. So to the guys, men and women fighting the war, it was really in a lot of ways one big conflict that just had two fronts.
Mhm.
And it depends which phase of that you caught, because Afghanistan started in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. So that's a lot of years of war and a lot of experience and a lot of veterans passing through those places. So we get to Afghanistan. July is just absolutely insane, mortars, rockets, machine guns, all these things that you would expect in a real war. And at 20, I was 21 years old at the time. I would say the average age of a Marine infantryman back then, you're between 19 and 24. If you're 25, 26, you're kind of like an old man to a lot of people. And but you at that age, you want to be there. You want to be there. And I think it's very important for people to understand that the American military, the Marine Corps, every branch is an all volunteer force. There's no one who's in the military who does not want to be there. And there's no one who's in the Marine Corps infantry, which was my experience, that doesn't want to be wherever the battlefield is and wherever the war is. And it takes that mentality of being a, 19 to however old young man, to think like that. But it's vital to what makes the American armed forces function, and especially the Marine Corps. I mean, that warrior ethos is bred through that mentality, and it's really necessary. So, Afghanistan, we get there in July, like I said, and it was crazy. And in July 23rd, 2009, that's when Nick Exaros was killed by an improvised explosive device. And that was really, and there was other casualties too in his battalion, 2-8, and then in mine, second LAR, we had our own casualties as well. But Nick was, my friend from back home. So it was different. Like we had started that journey together and we had grown up in the Marine Corps together, and we were supposed to get out together and go to college and do all these things that kids want to do. And then for him to be killed like that was just at that age very difficult to comprehend, almost impossible, I would say. We thought on some level we were really invincible.
Yeah.
You'd think, like, when you're that age, you think the whole world has to end before you do, and
Mm.
it's just a special time in your life when you have that mentality and that way of thinking about things. And through a pretty remarkable series of events, I was actually given the opportunity to go home in the middle of the deployment in July for Nick's funeral. And that was, a whole crazy story in itself, which is unheard of, to just leave your outpost at that time and go back to the United States for a week, 10 days, and come back to your battalion. So, but I did it, and it was a very difficult decision to do that, to leave my Marines for that period of time. But, I felt at the time it was the right thing to do, as hard as it was to go say goodbye to my friend. And then I came back from Nick's funeral and all that stuff, went back to my unit, and then there was more combat and more, casualties and all these things. And then luckily I made it home from Afghanistan intact. And then
Mm.
by that point, I only had about 6 months left in the Marine Corps, and I had made the decision I was going to get out because after Nick was killed, it just didn't have the same meaning it had to me previously. I was young and angry and confused and lost along the way. So
Yeah.
I got discharged from the Marine Corps honorably in 2010. And, I got out very, like I said, confused, angry, sad, all those emotions, and, trying to process the idea of going to war twice. And
Yeah.
luckily for me, I had a very strong support system, and I was pushed in a direction by our mutual friend, Steve Exaris, actually, Nick's father, to
Mm.
become a police officer. And that really, in a lot of ways, I don't want to say saved my life, but changed it immensely. It set me on a path that I don't think I would have found the strength on my own to go on, maybe.
Mm.
And I'm just saying that in hindsight, but that turned into a 15-year career. So that's kind of very long version of my backstory, I guess.
No, I appreciate it. I need it. So let me ask you this. When you were that young and you were deployed in either location, Iraq and Afghanistan, did you see it as sort of this, did you see it as the global war on terror, thinking about influence potentially from outside parties like Iran, or were you just focused on the foe right in front of you?
Both, both. I mean, I'm not by any means an expert on geopolitics, and I won't pretend to be. But the Middle East, that whole situation with the global war on terror, encompassed so many different moving parts. And Iran, especially in the the Iraq theater, was definitely a presence that you heard about. But it's like, as a 19, 20, 21-year-old, you're just dealing with what's right in front of you.
Mhm.
And you know that there's other people or other countries involved that are much bigger than you. I mean, when we were in Afghanistan, we could see signs of the Russians previously being there. So like that you're part of something that's big and transcends just your one little piece in that role, and that has been going on for a long time and probably will keep going on for a long time.
Yeah. I tried to do some research on Iran's specific influence in Iraq. It was obviously the supplying militias with explosively formed penetrators, the EFPs. And then you would probably know better, but in Afghanistan, more so um, monetary contributions to the Taliban and some explosives. Did you ever see an EFP or hear of anything like that while you were deployed?
I heard about them in Iraq, but I did not experience them. And from what I understood, that was definitely a big presence in Baghdad, in the bigger cities. From what I heard, again, I wasn't there. In Afghanistan, I mean, IEDs, improvised explosive devices, were huge. It became really the defining weapon of that conflict because once the Taliban realized they couldn't fight us conventionally between our air assets, our just superior tactics, and the might of the American military, their only option was to resort to burying bombs in the ground and then watching from a distance as they wreaked havoc on these young Americans.
Mhm. So put Operation Epic Fury to the side. What have your feelings been about the Iranian regime since your time in service, and their global reign of terror?
I mean, again, I'm not an expert on geopolitics, but it's obvious to me from the outside looking in as someone who participated in two of these conflicts that Iran holds a space on a global scale that is not in the best interest of America or the free world, and it's been that way for a very long time. And you can go all the way back to 1983 when they did the bombing that killed 241 service members. They were behind that, and they've been behind a lot of other acts of terror that people forget about as time goes on, like the American people do with everything. And it's just we're bombarded with so much information now and so many atrocities and tragedies that we forget history very quickly. And I think that the further we get away from those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the more quickly people forget why we were there and how that started with 9/11 too.
Mhm.
Like that, it's all tied together. And I think that the situation in Iran is certainly very volatile and has been for a really long time.
Mhm.
And does it make us safer in the world, the actions being taken now? I don't know. I really don't, but I hope it does.
Mhm. So yeah, that's the next question is, would you be willing to offer your opinion on these strikes? Do you think we can't know what's going to happen? We can't know whether the Iranian people are going to rise up and try and create a new government. But just simply the killing of Ayatollah Khamenei, do you think that is a positive uh, development?
I think we'll find out. I mean, I think we've done this experiment in the Middle East here a few times, and it hasn't really worked out so well the way we want it to, where we think we're going to, install a democracy in a box in these countries, and they're going to just all of a sudden align with American values. We've tried that multiple times at the cost of very many young American lives, and you're seeing that now once again. And I think it's important to remember that it's a very small fraction of the American population that serves in the military and fights these wars. And within that, it's even smaller of a fraction that is on the front lines of these things and sees combat. And those men and women that are willing to put themselves in that position to be in direct line of fire and put their lives at risk, they'll go wherever America sends them.
Mhm.
know, they don't serve the president of the United States, whoever it is, whether it's, Donald Trump or if it's Joe Biden or whoever. They serve America and its interests, and they'll go where they're told. And in my opinion, the Marine Corps, if they asked the Marine Corps to stay in Afghanistan for another 10 years, they would have done it. And they would have kept going, and they would have kept getting the missions done, and they would have said yes, sir, and followed their commanders. And because that's what they do. And that's what America's based on, is having young men and women who are willing to go where they're sent to be. But with that being said, it's important that the decisions that lead to that are thought out very well, and all other alternatives are exhausted, and all efforts for peace are exhausted. And what's happening in Iran now, did we get to that point? I don't really know, but it's hard to trust fully the government or anything now. And I think to have a healthy skepticism of things is a good way to be, but it's not, in my opinion, good to be totally against something or for something without gathering information and facts that's unbiased. You got to do your own research before you just side with something. And I think it's very important that people are informed and that they care, because these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were not that long ago. It was not that long ago that you had battles like Fallujah, Ramadi, Baghdad, Nasiriyah, Operation Kanjar in Afghanistan that I was a part of, for all these small or big cities and villages that most people will never hear of. That wasn't that long ago. And if Iran turns into some situation where there's American boots on the ground in force, I would hope that all other options have been exhausted before that happens, because that creates, that's how people get killed. And I've seen firsthand, as many other veterans, what it looks like for even one casualty in these conflicts, and what that does, and all of the people that affects, and all of the changes that makes in somebody's life forever. There's people that becomes their entire world, that they experience that forever. And, rightly so. It's can't be understated how valuable our American lives are, especially when we're sending them abroad for interests that serve politicians.
Mhm. And so my next question is, we know that 4 service members have already died in this conflict. How does that impact you personally?
I think it's terrible, but at the same time, I think that those service members made the ultimate sacrifice, and I'm sure that they were exactly where they wanted to be, doing exactly what they wanted to be doing. And with that comes a cost, and that people forget that that is the cost of freedom, and for the way that we live our lives in America and the ideals that we stand for. It comes at the cost of young American lives. And I, while it's absolutely terrible and tragic, and I can't even imagine what the families of these service members are going through right now, I hope that in some regard, people understand and respect the sacrifice that those people made on behalf of everything that we stand for as Americans. And if or when there are more casualties, I really hope and pray that people understand that that is the cost of freedom. And we need to make sure that we are doing what is right in the best interest of our country and its people before we put those service members in the positions to even be wounded or killed.
Mhm. So yeah, then I think my last question would be, obviously we can't tip off Iran with what assets we're putting in place and what we're willing to do and for how long we're willing to do it. But do you think that Congress and the American people are owed the fullest picture we can possibly give, because the stakes are so high, especially for American lives?
Absolutely. And you bring up such a good point. And that's one of the things that is frustrated me most about watching this, is if we're going to be doing this and basically starting a war with somebody. I don't know if we want to call it a war quite yet, but at least explain it to the American people in a way that's digestible to the average person who knows nothing about the situation. We've gotten lost in this hyperbole and rhetoric, and everything is just, you don't know what to believe, and you don't know, because of that, whether it's coming from, I don't, whatever political side of the fence you fall on, doesn't really matter. Because of that rhetoric and that hyperbole and that just showmanship that we've become accustomed to, you really don't know what to believe is in the best interest of America. It's like this thing in Iran that's going on right now could be the best military move that we've made in the last 2 decades, but it's presented in such a way that it's hard to believe that, and it's hard to know what's true. And, me being someone who served in the Marine Corps, that was, the greatest privilege I ever had in my entire life was to be in a combat zone in service of the United States wearing that Marine Corps uniform. And it always will be. I try my best to trust that whoever the president is doing things in the best interest of our country. But when they're lacking the ability to present and sell that to the American public, it creates this confusion where people, they don't know what to believe, and they get very angry. And, at the expense of that are American lives.
Andrew, is there anything else you want to tell me that I haven't touched on?
I think, I mean, we covered a lot, but I think it's important for people, we've become so politically divided now, and we live in such fear all the time, whether it's our own issues at home with mass shootings and all these terrible things that happen. And now we have all the world seems as volatile as it has ever been between what's going on right now and these military strikes that we're doing. I think it's important for people to ask themselves the question, do you love America and have pride in your country, regardless of who the president is, or regardless of, what rhetoric is out there or what the atmosphere is? Do you have pride in the place that you live, in the place that upholds these ideals of freedom and being whoever you want to be in this life, and being able to accomplish anything you want as long as you work hard? And there's a lot of areas of the country, the Middle East being the biggest one, who hate that idea. They hate everything we stand for. And I saw that firsthand when I was in the Middle East. There are people, I'm not saying all of them, but
Hmm.
there are fanatical ideologies that want nothing more than the demise of Western societies, and especially America. And if we start losing our own pride in our country because of all of this, what it oftentimes becomes kind of white noise and distractions, there's a chance that we get to a point where we're too far gone and nobody can unite over anything. And I think that would be a very sad thing. And I think that America is the greatest country in the world, and I will always think that. I really will. And I just hope what we do and the politicians that are in charge have the best interests of the American people in mind, because at the end of the day, the people who are going to be at the tip of the spear of these geopolitical decisions are young Americans that are willing to give their lives, for wherever their country sends them. And it'll always be that way. It's what makes us America.